It was a cold December morning, but Annie felt cozy and comfortable in the warm bed. She stretched under the soft blankets, enjoying the moment when the first rays of the sun began to penetrate through the blinds. Time seemed to stand still, and she did not want to leave this moment of peace and warmth next to your loved one. Annie and Jeff became a couple almost 10 years ago. Annie returned to her small hometown to take a job as a teacher at the local high school after graduating from university. She was always quite shy and a bookworm in high school. She found it difficult to make friends in the big city and missed her parents and the charm of a small, close-knit community. Therefore, when she was offered a job in her hometown, she did not hesitate. Her parents were delighted to have her back, especially since she had been staying with them while she saved money after university. Jeff was a few grades ahead in school. He was the captain of the football team and the life of the party. At school, their paths almost never crossed due to different social circles. He was big, strong, and handsome, and almost all the girls in the city were in love with him. After school, he began working in his father's hardware store. When Annie returned to town, a friend from church asked her to go on a blind date with Jeff because she thought they would be perfect for each other. Annie was shocked to find out who this mystery guy was and thought there had been a mistake. However, her doubts were quickly dispelled when they met. Despite his rough appearance, Jeff turned out to be kind, gentle, and clearly fascinated by her. Annie fell in love with him at first sight. However, Jeff told the story differently. He claimed that he noticed her at a church service when she sat a few rows ahead of him and immediately took notice of her. After the service, he asked everyone to find out more about the beautiful girl he did not recognize. Annie had to admit that she had changed a lot since she left school. She blossomed later than others, and at university her figure became feminine. Annie became interested in fitness to relieve stress after long hours of studying. She also found her own style and learned to highlight her porcelain skin with makeup. Her long black hair, which had always been messy before, had become one of her best features. When Jeff found out who she was, he asked his friend to arrange a meeting for them. The rest is history. Their romance was like the plot of a Hallmark Channel movie. They went on dates at the local cafe for milkshakes and spent days on Jeff's boat. Jeff charmed her parents, and his younger sisters accepted Annie as their own. 6 months into their relationship, he proposed to her on a warm summer evening as they looked at the stars from the back of his pickup truck. Annie's parents were not surprised because Jeff had asked for her father's blessing in advance. Both families were delighted, and preparations for the wedding soon began. 6 months later, they were married in a big reception on Jeff's father's property, attended by half the town. His sisters became bridesmaids, and Annie's old friends also joined her retinue. Jeff had never looked more beautiful than he did in his blue suit as he waited for her at the altar. Her father cried when the pastor declared them husband and wife. It was everything Annie could have dreamed of. They were both traditional and soon began trying to have children. By the age of 25, Annie was pregnant. A few months later, they were told at an ultrasound that they were having twins. It was a surprise, but Jeff's family had a lot of twins, and they were excited to welcome George and Jacob. They decided that twins were enough for them, and Jeff performed the procedure since Annie did not tolerate other types of protection well. The twins were almost impossible to tell apart as children, but now they were starting to show at least slight differences. They had recently turned 7 and were full of energy. The boys were so restless that it was difficult to keep track of them. Fortunately, their parents lived nearby and were happy to babysit their grandchildren when needed. Annie happily returned to work after the birth of her children, but this caused disputes in their marriage. Jeff, a traditionalist, believed that she should stay home with the children as his mother had done. However, Annie insisted on her own because the second salary significantly helped their family budget. Moreover, last year she was promoted to assistant principal of a high school, which brought a significant increase in income. Jeff had long been a manager at his father's hardware store, but essentially ran it entirely himself along with his younger brother. Hardy's Hardware had been an important part of their town for 40 years, and local residents remained loyal to the business despite the advent of chain stores. Over the years, Jeff was a devoted husband, and they rarely fought. Everything was almost perfect, except for one area. Their sex life gradually became routine. Annie's religious upbringing and her reserved nature had an impact on their relationship. Before the wedding, she tried to adhere to traditional views, although this was sometimes difficult for her. After marriage, their life together was stable, but somewhat predictable. Annie valued moments of intimacy with Jeff, enjoying their togetherness and how much he loved spending time together. Over time, as often happens, their closeness became less frequent. Jeff didn't have the same desire he used to when he turned 35, and Annie gained weight from her pregnancy. All this led to the fact that now their intimate life was limited to once every 4 to 6 weeks. Both were not completely happy with this state of affairs, but breaking the established routine was not easy. About a year ago, after receiving a promotion, Annie noticed that she had more free time in the mornings since she no longer had to prepare lesson plans. She decided to regain the confidence she lost after gaining weight. Annie started playing sports again like she did at university and gradually returned to her previous weight for the first time in 8 years. Her achievements brought joy. Her stomach became flatter, her legs tightened, and her face looked several years younger than her 32 years. But even though she was in great shape, her self-confidence was still at the level of the shy girl she had been at school. In addition, the increased desire for intimacy only increased her insecurity due to the rare moments of intimacy with her husband. Despite their attempts, they could not get out of their usual rhythm. Annie pressed herself against Jeff again, a little harder, hoping to get his attention. She felt him tense slightly, trying to get more comfortable. Jeff had been working a lot lately and was very tired, especially after a chain hardware store opened in town. Although Hardy's Hardware was doing well, Jeff was feeling the pressure. Annie knew that stress was also a factor in their problems in the bedroom. However, he was slow to respond to her attempts. From the very beginning of her marriage, it was difficult for her to get used to the fact that sex was now allowed. The guilt didn't go away immediately after they walked down the aisle. Even now, it was difficult for her to take the initiative too obviously. She had lived too long with the idea that any manifestation of desire was a sin. It was hard for her to admit, even to herself, how much she wanted a husband. After all, it is the man who should show desire, and the woman should not want him passionately. It had been several weeks since their last intimacy, and Annie longed to feel him close again. They only had 15 to 20 minutes before he usually got up. She pressed closer to him, trying to make him understand. Jeff was snoring lightly. Annie sighed heavily, realizing that this time nothing would work. We'll have to wait one more day. At least the weekend is almost here. George and Jacob were running around the backyard, playing some kind of game that only they understood. Annie watched them through the glass door at the back of the house. Both were wearing warm jackets, hats, and mittens. She could tell them apart only by the fact that she dressed them in clothes of different colors. The snow that had fallen a few days ago still covered the ground. The boys seemed delighted, running through the snowdrifts and stopping every now and then to make a snowball and throw it. Sunday was always one of her favorite days because the store was closed and Jeff stayed home. After church, Jeff usually watched sports games while Annie cleaned the house. And after lunch, she had a little time to herself to recuperate before the start of the new work week. Today, she took a long bath while reading a few chapters from a novel. She then began to prepare dinner while continuing to watch the boys playing outside. George seemed to be winning their game, but it was impossible to understand the rules. Annie smiled, looking at how happy her sons were. "What's for dinner?" Jeff asked, coming from the living room. "Steak, sweet potatoes, lima beans," she answered, feeling him come up behind her and kiss the top of her head. "Sounds amazing," he said, as if she hadn't cooked this hundreds of times. "I can't believe there are only a few weeks left until Christmas." "Don't tell me," Annie replied. "It seems that the school year has only recently begun, and it's almost time for the holidays." Jeff looked through the glass door, putting his arm around her shoulders. "They grow so fast. A little more, and they will find out that you know who doesn't exist." Annie laughed. I'm not sure I'm ready for them to grow up so quickly. I love seeing them get excited about Santa's arrival. Speaking of Santa, has he brought all the presents yet? Jeff asked. Annie usually did the bulk of the shopping for gifts for the children and parents. Jeff helped come up with ideas for major gifts and collected them. Last year, they bought a swing for the kids, and Jeff spent half the night assembling it so the boys could see the surprise in the morning. Almost. All that's left is to buy a few stocking stuffers and a gift for your mom, Annie replied. Everything seems to get more expensive every year. I tried to stay within budget, but I still had to go over it to get it all done. Yes, many goods in our store have also become more expensive, he said thoughtfully. I'm sure the situation is the same in other stores. Annie watched silently as the twins chased each other in the yard. I was reading an article about how someone makes thousands of dollars a day selling things online. Or maybe, on the contrary, buying in stores and reselling. To be honest, I didn't read much into it, Jeff said, thoughtfully recalling the details. I think I see stories all the time about people making money in the most unusual ways, Annie answered, checking the timer on the kitchen stove. Yes? He asked absently. Yes, some even make money by selling photographs of their feet, Annie said, remembering one of the most ridiculous cases she had read about. This caught Jeff's attention. What? He asked in surprise. They sell photographs of their feet, she repeated. Why would anyone do this? Jeff asked, puzzled. It's a fetish, Jeff. Some people are very attracted to this, Annie laughed, seeing his bewilderment. His face reflected horror at this discovery. Seriously? Why? I don't know, I don't have one, she answered, amused by his reaction. Jeff's life in a small, conservative town took its toll on him at times. People are strange, of course, he shook his head. Annie wanted to tease him a little more. What do you think? What if I start selling photographs of my legs? She asked in a serious tone, barely holding back her laughter. Well, you have beautiful legs, but I doubt that anyone will pay for it, he answered, still skeptical, not believing that this was even possible. I'm telling you, it's real, Annie animatedly tried to convince him. The timer rang and Annie turned it off as she took the steaks out of the oven. Well, I'm sure a lot of people would like your legs, he said, hugging her tighter. Annie wondered if maybe this was true. She had never thought much about what made legs attractive, but she liked the feeling of his hands on her. I don't know. She began, hoping to hear a few more compliments, but then the door opened sharply, and the boys flew into the kitchen like a small hurricane. Boys, Jeff said loudly, getting their attention. Go wash up for dinner and help Mom set the table. The twins rushed out of the room, and Jeff followed them to check. Annie looked lovingly at the snowy landscape outside the window. Christmas was just around the corner, and nothing could be better than the holidays. After dinner, they watched TV together and then put the boys to bed. Jeff climbed into bed while Annie washed herself in the bathroom. She was wearing thick flannel pajamas, suitable for a cold evening. When she came out of the bathroom, Jeff had already closed his eyes and was lying with his back to her side of the bed. There was a floor mirror against the wall next to the chest of drawers, which she usually looked at when getting ready in the morning. Annie looked at her reflection in the dim light of the bedroom. The loose flannel pajamas were far from sexy, but she thought she still looked good regardless. She slid under the covers and hugged her husband, placing her hand on his chest. Jeff shifted slightly, getting more comfortable. Annie hugged him tightly, enjoying how warm he was on these cold days. His body was always like a real heater under the blanket. She was initially a little intimidated by his size when they first started dating, but over time this feeling was replaced by a feeling of security. Jeff seemed about to fall asleep, so she gently pressed her ear to his. What, Annie? He asked without opening his eyes. I was just thinking. Maybe we could find some time to be alone and pay attention to each other. She hinted softly, trying not to be too direct. Good girls don't ask for it so directly. I'm so tired, he said, and I have to get up early tomorrow to meet the delivery load. Maybe we can move this until tomorrow. Okay, Annie replied in a cooler tone than she intended. She felt her husband's refusal immediately hit her self-esteem. She turned away from him and closed her eyes, trying to sleep. Behind her, Jeff sighed heavily. Their routine life continued. Annie sat quietly in the back of the small classroom, notepad and pen in hand, watching the young teacher teach a math lesson. She could feel the students starting to get nervous because the Christmas holidays were ahead of them. It was the last day of school before the holidays. There was a slight noise in the classroom. The children were whispering, fidgeting in their chairs, clearly unable to wait for the bell to ring. The teacher at the blackboard was trying to keep the class's attention. Despite the difficult task, he coped well. The lesson was carefully prepared. The explanations were clear. Annie noted that this young teacher was very enthusiastic and had already won the love of his students, which was rare in our time. However, despite her efforts to concentrate on observing, Annie's thoughts kept returning to Christmas and what she still needed to do to prepare. First, she had to complete several work reports before the end of the year. Then it was a matter of buying more gifts, wrapping them, and deciding when to spend time with each side of their family. Annie tried to refocus on her teacher's performance evaluation, but preparations for the holidays continued to distract her. She mentally ran through the list of gifts she still needed to buy and thought about how little time she had left to watch her favorite Christmas movies with her children. The bell rang and Annie stood up. The students filled the corridors with noisy hubbub and laughter. She smiled, exchanged a few encouraging words with the teacher, assuring him that he was doing a great job, and then headed out. The festive bustle was beginning to gain momentum. Here is the translation of the text into Russian. Annie made her way through the busy corridor. Lockers lined the walls, students taking books and other things from them for the next lesson. The classroom doors were lined with brightly colored posters announcing various school events as she made her way through the crowd. It was the same high school she had attended, and it seemed like not much had changed. She walked past the dining room, from where the aroma of lunch was wafting. It was pizza, she knew immediately. The sounds of lockers slamming, papers rustling, and children laughing filled her ears until she reached the privacy of her office. Annie sat down at her desk and logged into her computer to begin sorting through her overflowing inbox. For half an hour, she actively sent emails to parents, teachers, and even a school board member who asked questions about the school's academic performance for the year. Her fingers smoothly ran over the keys, but her thoughts gradually carried her to her husband. She looked at the framed photograph on her desk. The photo showed the two of them on a summer vacation, and she looked in the best shape she'd been in years. This did not go unnoticed by Jeff. It felt like they were on their honeymoon again, and they made love almost every night that week. But returning home, everything returned to normal. Annie felt herself filled with sexual energy. She wondered if Jeff would be in the mood tonight after he'd turned her down the night before. Her thoughts drifted back to the last few days and their interactions. She remembered another conversation that took place in their kitchen. Annie had always thought that women posted photos on the internet for money or attention, but now she thought, perhaps for some it was a way to gain recognition. Annie was tormented by doubts because she considered herself attractive when looking in the mirror, but this was not always felt by her husband's reaction. She looked at her reflection in the frame on the table again, admiring the view, but wondering why it wasn't enough for Jeff to chase her like before. Honestly, after all, there are guys who are turned on by just feet. She leaned back in her chair and rested her feet on the small stand under the table that she often used as a footstool. Her gaze lingered on her feet. A strange thought came to her, but she brushed it aside and returned to work. She decided to complete everything before the holidays. Annie has updated the school website with information about the new student of the year. She also added a schedule of sporting events for January. She took the form to the secretary to fax. The minutes passed slowly. She couldn't get this thought out of her head. Finally, she gave in to her curiosity and picked up the phone. After making sure he wasn't connected to the school Wi-Fi, she typed "cell-foot photos" into her browser's search bar. The first page of the search was filled with websites and forums where people were selling or posting pictures of their feet. There were links to pages and videos describing how to make money by selling such photos. Annie tried to avoid sites with explicit nudity or overly scandalous content while she was researching information. Finding a site that looked right to her, she clicked on it and started scrolling through the pages, looking at photos of legs in different poses. She read comments in which women received compliments. She was filled with the desire to feel just as attractive and desirable. Annie thought, feeling a temptation she had never experienced before. It seemed to her as if it was not she herself who filled out the information to create an account, but someone else. She used her personal email address, which Jeff wouldn't see. She entered her information honestly, although she was tempted to lie about her age or weight. But something pushed her to tell the truth. None of this could be identified anyway. When she finished registering, she sat quietly, looking at the phone. Could she really do this? Will people even look at her photos? And if so, it is unknown how they will react. She took off her shoes and socks and looked at her feet. My nails had been painted a few weeks ago, but they no longer looked fresh. She didn't consider her legs anything special, much less sexy. Annie took a deep breath and tried to imitate the photographs she had seen. She took some close-up shots, others from afar. She tried turning her foot towards the light, even using portrait mode on her phone to make the photos more artistic. She felt incredibly awkward. This is crazy, Annie thought, trying to find a good angle. What is she doing? She sat back down in her chair, sighing heavily. The mother of two didn't know what came over her, but the temptation subsided a little. She closed the tab and started putting her shoes back on. Annie knew she was just feeling frustrated by the lack of physical attention. Her love language has always been physical touch. Her morning desperation underscored the impact this was having on her. Her porcelain cheeks were flushed with embarrassment that she was seriously considering posting pictures of her legs to strangers on the internet. She decided to put these thoughts aside and return to work. There was too much to do and too little time left before the holidays. Annie woke up in a cold bed. She didn't remember Jeff getting up in the morning, but he was gone. He probably left early again to go to the hardware store. It was still dark outside. Even the twins had not yet woken up. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her social media feed, watching a few videos before getting out of bed. She took off her pajamas and turned on the shower. She placed her head under the hot stream of water, letting the warmth relax her muscles as the tub filled with steam. Today, she planned to go into town and look for small gifts for Jeff and the boys. She also needed to go to the mall in the next county to buy a gift for her mother-in-law, but maybe she'd save that for another day. Lathering her hair with shampoo, she enjoyed the heat of the shower. They had already made plans to spend time with both families in the coming week, but Annie had also made sure to leave a few evenings at home for them. She wanted to watch Christmas movies with the boys. It was one of her favorite memories from childhood when she was with her parents. She made a mental list of movies she wanted to watch while she carefully shaved her legs. No other holiday has movies like Christmas. No matter how many times you watch them, they never get boring. After finishing her shower, she dried herself off and began styling her hair and applying makeup. Annie wore blue jeans and a thick sweater. Due to the cold weather, she chose black leather knee-high boots. Zipping her boots, she checked herself in the mirror again. Even in warm winter clothes, her slender figure was noticeable, and her long black hair flowing over her shoulders gave her a slightly more exotic look than she really did. She turned around and was pleased with her appearance. After collecting the twins, Annie took them to her parents' house for a few hours to finish her Christmas shopping. Her path lay in the city, and she drove slowly, admiring the holiday decorations. Some houses were decorated with the huge inflatable figures that have been popular in recent years, others with traditional lights, but almost every house had something fancy. I'll have to take the twins to see the lights this week, she thought. Admiring Christmas decorations was another favorite tradition. As she drove past the hardware store, she tried to see Jeff. The store was called Hardy's Hardware. Annie always thought Hardy was a great name for a hardware store owner, but what she liked best was the smaller lettering, and Sons. She didn't see Jeff, but the store looked busy, which was good. She turned onto Main Street. All the stores were decorated for the holidays, with twinkling lights lining the roofs and storefronts, a wreath hanging from every street light, and a Christmas tree in the town square towering in the distance. The city looked like something out of a postcard, which was one of the reasons why the holidays here were so special. However, her attention returned to driving. The street was full of shoppers. The sidewalks were filled with families and individuals moving from store to store. Annie parked in the lot and quickly found a spot. It was just a few steps to the shops. The cool air was invigorating, and she watched her breathing, exhaling steam, trying to enjoy this moment. There's nothing better than the holidays. Annie visited several local stores. In the bookstore, she found a book for George's Christmas, stalking a story about a frog going on an adventure. She knew that Jeff, reading this book, would bring it to life for his son. At the confectionery, she bought chocolate for both boys. In one of the stores, she found a rubber ball that jumped higher than anything she had seen before. The twins would definitely be delighted. She also looked into the small boutique owned by her friend Susan. He and Susan had known each other since childhood, going to school and church together, although they were not close friends in their youth. But Susan warmly welcomed Annie when she returned to her hometown, and it was she who introduced her to Jeff. "Merry Christmas," Annie greeted as she walked inside. "Merry Christmas, Annie. Are you shopping for the last few gifts?" Susan asked, putting down the magazine she was looking at. "Yes, but I decided to buy something else for myself," Annie answered, laughing. "Great, always glad to see you. All the new items are on those hangers. If you need anything, tell me." Susan pointed to several hangers. "There are a couple of things here that I immediately thought would suit you." "Thanks, Susan," Annie said as she walked towards the counters. She wanted to find something to wear to upcoming holiday events. After choosing a skirt and a couple of dresses, Annie walked over to Susan. "Oh, great choice. They'll look amazing on you," Susan said approvingly, inspecting the items she had chosen. "Jeff will go nuts to see you in this," she added with a wink, guiding Annie towards the fitting room. "I don't think so," Annie tried to brush it off, accepting the compliment. Susan opened the fitting room and left her alone so she could try everything on. Annie took off her sweater and jeans, then began trying on the selected items. She carefully studied how the clothes fit on her. One of the dresses turned out to be perfect for going to church. It was dark green, long and flowing. The skirt was cute too. The other dress was too short for her taste. It only reached mid-thigh. She loved the way it accentuated her legs, but decided it would be inappropriate to wear it in public as a mother and wife. Looking at her reflection in the new dress, Annie wondered what people really thought about her appearance. She immediately pulled herself together. Is she really that desperate for recognition? Jeff said she looked great. People often complimented her. But what else could they say? She knew that it was impossible to get an objective opinion from them. Plus, Jeff's reaction to her wasn't the same as before, when he literally couldn't keep his hands off her. If this was not the most objective answer, then what was? She sighed heavily, feeling disappointed at the lack of passion in their relationship lately. Her gaze dropped down to her feet. The boots were taken off. Temptation began to rise within her again. She wondered how Jeff would react if he found out about this. This may be crazy, but it's harmless, she thought. After all, these are just photographs of feet. Trying not to make a big deal about it, she made several clumsy attempts to photograph her legs. After several takes, she found an angle that seemed more or less successful to her. Trying to rationalize her behavior, Annie thought that since she herself did not consider legs to be something sexy, then it was not that important. She tried not to think about how others might perceive such photographs. She selected the photo and uploaded it. A moment later, her post appeared on the forum. Annie held her breath, nervously refreshing the page every few seconds. Nothing. She updated again. Still nothing. Her heart sank in slight disappointment. Putting the phone aside, she changed back into jeans and a sweater, buttoned up her boots, and decided to check the phone again. The waiting was killing her. One like, she noted. Well, at least it's something, Annie thought, trying to cheer herself up. You just need to wait a little. Did you find everything you were looking for? Susan asked as Annie walked up to the register. She took the skirt and dress to fold them and punch the check. Yeah, you always have such great choices, Annie replied. They continued chatting about the holidays and plans for the coming days. I can't wait for Thursday anymore. It's been too long since we got together, Susan said. Annie knew she was right. Everyone had been too busy the last couple of months, and she had only seen Susan a couple of times. Too long, Annie agreed. We can't afford to not see each other for so long again. Susan came out from behind the counter and hugged Annie. It was great to see you. Thanks for coming, Susan said, handing her a bag of groceries. See you in a couple of days for lunch, Annie replied, stepping out into the cold. She walked slowly to the car, enjoying the crunch of the snow under her boots and the cold air that invigorated her senses. It all reminded her why she loved the holidays so much. She was enjoying the walk to her car, but the thought of the photo she posted earlier kept popping up in her head. It was so out of character for her that she felt like a different person. How could I decide to do this, she thought. Annie always tried to behave modestly, especially on social networks, where she never even posted photos in a swimsuit. She always dressed rather conservatively in keeping with her upbringing, and after her marriage, she became even more reserved. She felt guilty for posting something so controversial, but at the same time, she doubted that it would attract anyone's attention at all. Getting into the car, she tried to distract herself from these thoughts. On the way home, she turned on the radio, and her mood improved slightly from the sound of Christmas songs. When she finally got home, Annie placed the boutique bag on the kitchen table. She had a few hours left before the twins had to be picked up from her parents, and she decided to use this time to relax. She picked up a book from the bedroom nightstand and settled down on the living room couch, wrapped in a cozy blanket. It was a romantic comedy about a couple who gradually turned from enemies to lovers. The male character was already clearly experiencing feelings, but the main character continued to persist in her contempt. Annie loved books like these. There was always something reassuring about them, obvious hints of a happy ending, a lack of unpredictable twists, and an obligatory happy ending. She smiled as she read about how the characters were finally starting to bond and thought about what it was like for her and Jeff. She recalled their first dates, the passion that made them almost not wait for the wedding. She could still remember how they could barely contain themselves in the back seat of his truck. Then he couldn't tear himself away from her. Now everything seemed too ordinary and routine. Thoughts about photography began to return again. It felt like a new, forbidden experience, something that brought out an excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. She tried to concentrate on reading, but the phone was lying next to her, and the temptation to check the post was too strong. Well, I'll just take a quick look, she decided. Opening the post, Annie was amazed. It already had 22 likes and 4 comments. She froze in surprise, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. She scrolled down to see the comments. Very sexy, the first comment read. Simple, but it made her feel that way. It was a word Jeff had never used against her, but it made a strong impression on her. She was confused by this, but at the same time she felt inspiration running through her. She laughed at herself, feeling like a schoolgirl receiving her first compliment from a boy. Wow, the next comment read. This is probably something good too, Annie thought, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and joy. What would I do to worship your feet? She read the next comment. Wow, that's pretty intense. She wasn't sure how to feel about it, but at least they seemed to like the photo, she thought. However, the last comment caught her attention. It made me so horny. Show us more. Annie couldn't help but feel a little flattered as she read this. She doubted she had ever aroused any man other than Jeff. Is this serious? Could someone really get aroused just by looking at her legs? Lately, she had to literally force herself on Jeff, and even then it didn't always work. She reread the second part of the comment again. Show us more. She felt a slight thrill, despite the almost scalding water in the bathroom. This really was a crazy idea. Kevin McAllister screamed at the screen, making the whole family laugh. The boys were lying on Jeff, tired after the recent fight with their dad. Finally, they calmed down to watch the movie. Home Alone has always been one of her favorite Christmas movies, and this year she couldn't wait until the boys were a little older to appreciate it. Spending some alone time earlier in the day was nice, but nothing compared to the family moments during the holidays. The magic of this time of year was especially felt thanks to children, making everything around more exciting. She remembered their expressions last year when they baked cookies and found them bitten the next morning. It warmed her heart. This year, the whole family picked out a tree the first weekend after Thanksgiving. She couldn't wait and insisted that Jeff drive them right away. They decorated it together. Jeff hung garlands, and the children helped hang toys. Now the tree stood perfectly, the fireplace crackled nearby, and their Christmas stockings hung above the mantelpiece. She hoped the children would remember these moments as fondly as she remembered Christmases with her parents. Annie reached for the mug of hot cocoa on the coffee table, but it was empty. She didn't even notice how she drank it all. "Anyone else want cocoa?" she asked everyone at once. "Yees," the twins shouted in unison. Annie and Jeff laughed. "No, I don't need it, just these two," he answered. In the kitchen, she poured cocoa powder into a mug and poured milk over it. While the microwave hummed, she scrolled through social media on her phone. From the living room came the sound of a movie that my husband and children were watching. Annie bit her lip in thought and switched to another app, taking another glance to make sure no one was coming. A few more likes appeared, but there were no more comments. She was surprised by how much it upset her. It's just a photo of her legs, she thought. To be honest, she was amazed that anyone even took the time to comment. She tapped her foot impatiently. "Show us more." She couldn't get it out of her head. Annie checked again that no one was coming. She pulled her sweatpants up to her mid-calf and took several pictures from different angles, trying to show off the curves of her feet. The microwave beeped, ending its timer. She opened the door, took out hot cocoa, and prepared another mug. This time, while she was waiting, she didn't hesitate, chose one of the photos she liked and clicked Publish. She waited to see if there would be a similar response. A minute later, Annie returned to the living room with cocoa for the children and herself. She sat down on the sofa, stretched her legs, and made herself comfortable. The children laughed loudly at the scene where the characters slipped on the ice. Annie took out her phone while she drank her cocoa. Her position on the couch allowed her privacy. She opened a forum where she posted the photo. This time, the comments came faster. "This is great, glad to see your post again," one user wrote. Another added, "I'd love to try these fingers." She imagined that they were excited because of her, that they wanted her. Jeff laughed at the movie, and Annie bit her lip, enjoying her little secret. The restaurant was decorated for Christmas. There were garlands hanging everywhere and sparkling lights. Each table was lined with poinsettias, adding a touch of red to the room. A large Christmas tree took center stage and almost reached up to the 12-foot ceiling. Annie was wearing a black skirt that she bought last week at a boutique and black heels. Her heels clicked softly on the floor as she walked through the restaurant. The skirt fell just below her knees, and on top she wore a red sweater that looked elegant and festive. Every year she had dinner with several close friends where they exchanged gifts. Annie spotted Susan and the others at a table in the back of the restaurant. Alice and Beth were already sitting with Susan, so Annie came last. "Hello, Annie," Susan exclaimed. "This skirt looks great on you." She hugged Susan, Beth, and Alice, who stood up to greet her. "Thank you, I bought it at a nice boutique in the city," she joked. "Beth, good to see you." "And I you." "We haven't seen each other for a long time," Beth answered. Alice hugged her, squeezing her tightly in her arms. Alice did not grow up in their town, but moved here with her husband after his graduation. In a way, she was funny. Petite, with sharp features and blonde hair, she had a competitive nature that sometimes made it difficult for her to get along with the locals. Until she met their group, she didn't feel like she belonged in this city. The waiter brought Annie water while they chatted and studied the menu. "How are things going with you and Michael?" Alice asked Beth. Michael was her last boyfriend. Her high standards had long prevented her from getting married, and now the local circle of potential suitors was very limited. They dated for about 3 months, although almost no one saw them together. Annie believed that Michael did not live up to Beth's level, but he was not the worst of her suitors. He worked as a plumber and made good money, but left a strange impression. This may have been due to the fact that when he worked at the hardware store, there was some tension between him and Jeff. "It's okay," Beth replied. "How are things going with you and Dave?" "Don't change the subject." Alice immediately stopped her attempt to avoid details. "What can I tell you?" Beth pretended that she didn't care. "How are you doing?" Honestly, Alice insisted. She was always the most straightforward in their group. Although she wasn't the glue that held them together like Susan, Alice was the one who brought sincerity to the conversation. Beth looked a little embarrassed. "I don't know," she said. "Everything seems fine, but he's not the kind of person who wants to settle down." "If a man doesn't want to settle down with you, he's just crazy," Susan said, taking a sip of water. Annie agreed with this. Beth was truly amazing, a real gem. "If he doesn't want to settle down, it means he either has attachment problems or is dating someone else," Alice said bluntly. Beth blushed at her words. Annie tried to soften the situation. "She just means that we all like Michael, but it's a little disturbing," she said as gently as possible. "Sometimes it can be difficult." "Michael is a lot more demanding than other men I've dated," Beth admitted. "In what sense?" asked Alice. The face darkened. "For example, the way I dress when we go somewhere." Susan's eyes widened, but Alice answered first. "So he controls you?" she asked seriously. "No, I wouldn't say that. It's just that he—" She paused, searching for words. Annie also thought it felt like control, especially for someone you've only been dating for a few months. "Didn't he work with Jeff a few years ago?" "What does Jeff think of him?" asked Susan. Annie didn't want to discuss Jeff's opinion because it was quite negative. "He considered Michael an unpleasant person and mentioned that he was too cunning." They didn't seem to get along very well," Annie admitted, avoiding Beth's eyes. "Let's change the subject," Beth asked. Susan and Annie happily turned the conversation to another topic, trying to keep Alice from returning to the topic. Although Alice meant well, Annie didn't want to spoil the dinner. They could discuss this later. While her friends were discussing their families and jobs, Annie noticed a young woman in high heels walking by. Her thoughts instantly returned to her hidden hobby. She felt dependent sitting there with her friends. They laughed and joked, and all she thought about was whether strangers on the internet had left comments under her photos. Annie snapped back to reality, picking up the conversation just in time. Alice complained about her relatives on her husband's side. "Don't even get me started on Dave's mom. She always manages to make little comments that freak me out. I bake a pie, and she remarks that it is almost like a store-bought one." "I know, Martha, this is not a compliment," said Alice. The other women laughed heartily. "Annie seems to be the luckiest with her relatives." "No one could be nicer than Jeff's parents," Susan said. Annie smiled. "They are really very kind. But I'll be back now. I'll go to the ladies' room," she said, apologizing. She headed towards the exit of the hall to find the toilet. It was decorated with marble countertops and soft lighting that accentuated her features. There was no one inside except her. Annie took out her phone and reopened the website she kept returning to. Annie felt extremely disappointed when she saw that there were no new comments on her posts. They seemed to have gotten lost among more recent publications. She knew she needed to post something new to get attention again. Her legs looked even better now than in the photo she posted last night. She thought that her black shoes would probably attract attention, and she could quickly make a new post. She tried several poses, with and without shoes, but she didn't like any of the pictures. She really wanted to post something that would make an impact. Then an idea came to her mind that made her heart beat faster. "Show us more." The comment on her first post came back to her mind. Using the bathroom mirror, Annie took several full-length photos, holding the phone so that her face was not in the frame. She took some mirror shots and some more posed shots. She turned sideways to show off her slender body and the curve of her hip. She then decided to take some photos that were more explicit, playing with the camera. Luckily, no one came in while she was taking photos. When she finished, she disappeared into one of the booths. Annie flipped through the photos she had taken and settled on one that she particularly liked. It was a shot taken in an attempt to look as sexy as possible. She didn't expect that she would like him so much, but now, looking at him, she felt that this photo would have an effect. In this photo, she lifted one leg, lifting her skirt to expose almost all of her clean-shaven leg. Her tight sweater accentuated her small waist and neatly outlined her chest, creating the illusion of an hourglass. Her dark hair fell softly in waves over her shoulders and chest. Annie was sure that her face was hidden enough that no one could recognize her. This photo was much more revealing than the previous leg photos, and she couldn't believe she was seriously considering posting it. She almost changed her mind, but there was something about this feeling of attention that she wanted to experience again. Since she started publishing, her confidence has increased significantly. She captioned the photo briefly, "A little more." It seemed appropriate. Once she hit publish, she put her phone away and returned to the table. Meanwhile, the conversation moved on to another topic, but when Annie returned, Susan took the floor. "I have something very happy for you all, and I wanted to share it when we are all together." "Are you pregnant?" Beth almost screamed. "No," Susan laughed. "Even better. We bought an apartment in Florida, right on the beach. This is an investment property, but we can book it for ourselves as a holiday home. And I would like to invite you all to our first summer vacation. There are 4 bedrooms, so we can all fit together." "Oh my God, this will be so fun," Alice screamed. Annie joined in with the joyful plans and questions, discussing what they would do and how wonderful it would be to spend a week together. The rest of lunch passed quietly. After the meal, they exchanged gifts. Annie gave Beth a pampering set and received a beautiful tea set from Susan. They said goodbye, promising to meet more often in the new year and make efforts to make the trip to the sea happen. When Annie got into the car, she immediately took out her phone to check her post. This time, there were dozens of likes and many comments. The risky shot lived up to her expectations. She skimmed through the comments, memorizing some of them. But with the more candid photography came more candid comments. "Damn, you are absolutely amazing," she read. She was overcome with almost childlike excitement. Nothing like this had ever been written to her. Some comments admired her legs and figure, others were happy that she posted the photo again. But, just like the first time, one of the comments especially caught her attention. It made her blush, but she read it over and over again. The idea that she had the power to excite a strange man she had never met was incredibly attractive. It made Annie feel sexy and wanted. Her thoughts were racing as she drove home. Annie glanced at Jeff, who was intently watching the football game. The children were engrossed in playing on the carpet. She wanted to get Jeff's opinion of Beth's boyfriend to see if his attitude had changed since they worked together. "Beth is dating Michael. He used to work with you," she asked, trying to sound as if she didn't remember all the details. "Michael Gonzalez?" Jeff raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I can't believe Beth is dating this loser." "Loser is probably too harsh," Annie said. "No, he's definitely a loser," Jeff said seriously. "Is there really no one better for her?" "Anyone would be better than him," Jeff continued. She laughed. "Maybe Beth should follow his example and start dating before all the good guys get married." Jeff smiled. "It's surprising that they don't line up to be with her." He paused for a moment and then added, "Is she going to take him to the beach with her if we go?" "I doubt they'll be dating by then, but who knows? If he really is as strange as you say, I think Susan and Alice will be against it too," Annie replied. She looked at her watch and realized that time had flown by. "It's time to go to bed," she told the children. The twins whined at the same time. "It's late," she insisted. "You will have a lot of time for games tomorrow." They reluctantly went to get ready for bed. Annie followed them, making sure they brushed their teeth and put away their dirty clothes. She tucked them into bed, read them a story until their eyes began to droop, and stayed until they fell asleep. When she returned to the living room, she discovered that the children weren't the only ones asleep. Jeff appears to have dozed off on the couch. He must be very tired, Annie thought. She gently woke him up so he could get ready for bed while she busied herself turning off the lights in the house for the night. Annie was driving to a shopping center in a nearby town, which was 45 minutes from her home, wondering what else she could give her mother-in-law. The shopping center was located in a city much larger than her home, and in the run-up to Christmas, traffic on the roads turned into a real nightmare. There were far more people here than on Main Street a few days ago. Annie thought a nice scarf or sweater would complement the gifts they already had for her mother-in-law. She visited stores such as Ann Taylor and several others where she thought she could find suitable clothing. Walking from one store to another, she thought as she looked through the rows of clothes. Finally, she came across an elegant dark blue scarf. The material was expensive and luxurious, and Annie was sure Jeff's mother would be delighted. The older woman behind the register seemed to be in a talkative mood. "What a wonderful accessory. It's nice to see that some people still have good taste," she continued. Annie only now began to listen to her, completely missing the previous words. "It's for my mother-in-law, but I think it's totally her style," Annie replied, trying to appear more interested in the small talk than she actually felt. "You know, I look at these girls who walk around here, and I think, my father would never allow me to leave the house without decent clothes," the woman continued, switching to a tone close to indignation. "All they do is show everything they have to any man who wants to look. Can you imagine?" Annie almost laughed, but stopped herself in time. "No, I can't imagine," she answered with her best serious expression. After a couple more minutes of conversation, she took the package with her purchase and left the store. She headed towards the food court, thinking about coffee. As she made her way through the crowd, her attention was caught by a group of girls leaving the store ahead of her. They looked about 20 years old and were dressed stylishly. Their clothes seemed more suitable for warmer weather than they were outside. Without a doubt, these were the same girls the saleswoman was talking about. Young, attractive, dressed in a way that emphasizes their strengths. The packages they were carrying were from a store that Annie herself had never entered. He clearly attracted an audience 10 years her junior. She thought for a while, but decided that the likelihood of meeting someone she knew here was low, and curiosity got the better of her. She entered the store and began to look around. The girl behind the register was a petite blonde who fit in perfectly with the group Annie had just seen. Pop music was playing in the store, and the windows were filled with mannequins in provocative outfits. Annie felt out of place as she made her way to the racks of clothes. This was clearly a store for younger, or at least less conservative, women. She did find a few things she liked. It was high-waisted black jeans, a relatively modest blouse, and a skirt that seemed perfect for an evening out. She quickly changed into the jeans she had chosen. After twirling in front of the mirror, she was pleased with how the high waist emphasized her figure. Annie bit her lip and had a slightly mischievous thought. She pulled her jeans down just below her butt and took a photo in the mirror. The only thing that covered her was black lace panties. She knew the photo would be appreciated. Her butt looked incredible, and the black panties added a special aesthetic to the photo that she didn't even intend. She posted a photo on the forum and began trying on the chosen top. The blouse fit true to size, but Annie wasn't thrilled with it. She took it off and put on her old clothes. She was about to take off her jeans, but decided to check what was being written under her post. This time, the comments appeared almost instantly. "This is the most beautiful butt I have ever seen. Will you show me more?" wrote one of the anonymous users. Annie felt a rush of adrenaline reading the comments. She continued flipping through them. "What an amazing body." She read the next comment. And another one read, "I would let you do anything at any time." She felt excitement wash over her again. It had been a long time since she felt so attractive. Honestly, had she ever felt so wanted? These strangers begged to see more, saying they would do anything for her. This only inflamed her more. God, she couldn't imagine what Jeff would think if he knew what they were saying about her. This thought made her even more excited. He would be furious if he found out. Annie looked in the mirror and decided to give the people what they were asking for. She took another photo. It was surprisingly sexy and much more revealing than her previous photos. Maybe they were right, she thought, looking at her toned stomach and well-defined hip bones where she held the lace. She really looked very sexy. Annie changed back into her clothes, bought jeans and a skirt from the blonde at the register, and then went on her way. The next item had to be coffee. She ordered a small latte and stood in line with the rest of the customers. She looked around. All the visitors were engrossed in their phones, and no one paid attention to her. She decided she could discreetly open the site and scroll through the comments. No one will read what is written there, right? This is how she calmed herself down. She scrolled down the page and came across another comment. "I would have sex with you properly," wrote one of the comments. Annie blushed at the harsh language, but God, it made her feel incredibly wanted. She and Jeff made love, but she had never felt such an animal desire. Jeff never had sex with her the way she wanted. Annie felt a wave of embarrassment even as she said the word to herself. She continued scrolling. "Do you have an OnlyFans?" asked another user. OnlyFans. She knew what it was, although rather vaguely. "Annie?" The girl behind the counter called out to her, handing her the latte she ordered. She put the phone away and took the coffee. The journey back home took twice as long due to traffic jams. All this time she drank coffee and thought about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. She had a lot to think about. Annie opened her eyes as Jeff put on his shirt and left the bedroom. He headed into the kitchen and she heard him start making coffee. Annie reached over to the nightstand and picked up her phone, eagerly anticipating what awaited her in the morning. Although she had never been one to immediately reach for her phone when she woke up, it had now become one of the first things she thought about every morning. She listened, made sure Jeff was still in the kitchen, and unlocked her phone to open the forum. There had been several new comments added to the post since her last visit, but she was looking for one in particular. She didn't have to look for him for long. This comment was the most popular, with dozens of likes. Annie bit her lip, looking at the text. OnlyFans. She knew she had to be out of her mind to seriously think about it, but she tossed and turned all night, thinking about the idea. Jeff returned with coffee and sat down next to her on the bed. "What are your plans for Christmas Eve?" he asked. "I hope you haven't forgotten about the service this evening." "You said the store would close early, so there shouldn't be any problems," she reminded him. With Christmas falling on a Friday this year, their church's big Christmas service was scheduled for Wednesday evening. Susan and Beth were to perform in the choir, and Annie was looking forward to it. "Of course not," he assured. "The store closes at 2. But I meant, are there any other plans before that? Maybe there are still gifts left." "Fortunately, no. The scarf I bought for your mom yesterday was the last thing we needed," she replied with relief. "Now all that's left is to wrap everything up." Jeff smiled at her. "I will support you spiritually while you carry this cross," he joked, getting out of bed. "Love you, and I'll be home in time to get ready for the evening." One of the qualities that Annie especially appreciated about Jeff was that if he said he would do something, he would do it. "And I love you," she replied, watching him leave for work. After finishing her coffee and making sure the boys were dressed, she turned on another one of her favorite Christmas movies while the kids played. They were again enthusiastically building something with their blocks and figures without any obvious meaning, but with great pleasure. Annie watched the movie, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Dozens of reasons immediately came to mind why creating OnlyFans was a terrible idea. But she couldn't get rid of these thoughts. She could have remained anonymous, hiding her face, as she had done so far. Nobody will ever know. Any money she could make would just be a nice bonus. This is not cheating, because she did not enter into a relationship with anyone. Deep down, Annie knew she was justifying every reason not to do it, but that wasn't the point. She wanted recognition and praise. She craved it. She had never considered herself sexually liberated, but now it was impossible to deny it. Provocative comments, thoughts about men who could indulge themselves while looking at her photographs awakened something new in her. Despite her marriage and family, this experience gave her something she never knew she needed. It was like awakening a part of her that had previously been sleeping. Years of suppressing my emotions and desires led to a marriage where sex often felt like an obligation. Her pleasure was always limited by guilt. Jeff was a caring and loving husband, but he, too, seemed to be holding back. But Jeff didn't make her feel the way the comments did. That's why she couldn't stop thinking about the comments. That is why she continued to publish more and more of her photos on the internet. That's why, as soon as she read that comment, she knew the creation of OnlyFans was inevitable. Annie felt like the wall inside her had collapsed. All repressed emotions and desires were now free. She knew what she wanted. Annie bit her lip and smiled, knowing that now she would begin to get what she wanted. The service ended and Annie followed Jeff out of the pew, followed by the twins. The Christmas service was wonderful with lots of music performed by the choir. Like the rest of the parishioners, they greeted and congratulated their friends and neighbors on the upcoming holiday. Jeff was shaking hands with one of the deacons. He looked incredibly attractive. The sports jacket emphasized his broad, muscular shoulders. Despite the years since he stopped playing football, his active lifestyle has helped him stay in great shape. Annie considered herself a lucky woman. She wore a beautiful red dress for the evening. It was modest enough, but she still felt cute. Together, she thought they looked great. "Annie, how did you like the service?" Susan asked, hugging her and pulling her into a tight hug. "It was wonderful." "You all did an amazing job," Annie responded admiringly. It truly was one of the best services she had seen. "Have you seen Beth?" "She's around here somewhere," Susan asked, looking around. "She came with Michael," she added, giving Annie a meaningful look. At that moment, Annie noticed their friend. Beth walked up to them, beaming with joy, and hugged Annie as well. "Merry Christmas, Annie," she said. "I was so nervous about the solo performance, but now I'm so glad I decided to do it." Beth was dressed in a white dress, which gave her the image of a real angel. "I didn't even suspect that you could sing like that," Annie answered. "Now I think I need to have a karaoke night." Beth frowned. I'm not sure I'm ready for such a test." Annie laughed at her friend's reaction. At that moment, Michael came up and hugged Beth, standing next to her. "Hello, everyone," he said, waving to the general group. He was clearly out of his element, dressed in a wrinkled shirt, tucked in somehow, work jeans and boots. His hair looks greasy and unkempt, further emphasizing the difference between him and the neatly dressed Beth. Looks like he came straight from work. "Hi, Michael," Annie answered pleasantly, trying not to show any awkwardness. The company fell into tense silence for a moment. Luckily, they were saved by Jeff, who returned to Annie. "Great job, you two," he praised Beth and Susan. "You should work on getting Annie to join the choir." Susan laughed. "We try, but she doesn't agree." "I just look like an angel, but I definitely don't have a voice," Annie joked. Jeff gently squeezed her waist, showing his love. They chatted some more until Beth and Michael left. Susan and Annie gossiped about them a little after they left, and then it became clear that it was time to get ready to go home. "Well, excuse us. Looks like it's time for us to catch these guys and take them home," Jeff said as he said goodbye. They hugged their friends, picked up the twins, and headed to Jeff's truck. The drive home was quiet. The children fell asleep in the back seat. Annie intertwined her fingers with Jeff's and rested her head on his broad shoulder. Christmas music played softly from the speakers. It seemed like all was right in the world as she looked at the blurry lights of the Christmas lights outside the window. Jeff pulled into their driveway, but the kids never woke up. The house was dark as Jeff carried them to bed and put them to bed, and Annie went to the bathroom. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what she had decided. Annie left the bathroom and headed to the bedroom. Jeff glanced at her as he changed clothes, but said nothing. She finally made up her mind there was nowhere to retreat. Walking up to him, Annie placed her hand on his shoulder, drawing his attention. In her gaze, one could read confidence and tenderness at the same time. Without letting the moment end, she gently pushed him, and he sat on the edge of the bed. Their lips met in a kiss full of emotion and desire. Jeff answered her, but was still trying to say something when Annie continued decisively. There was a spark between them that seemed almost tangible. Jeff felt it just as keenly as Annie. There was passion in her movements, but also an amazing softness that he always loved. It was as if she wanted to show him everything she felt, without further ado. They were engrossed in each other, sharing a moment of intimacy and understanding. Jeff carefully watched her every gesture, as if it was the first time he had seen her like this, determined and beautiful. Annie felt strong and wanted. After that, their hugs lasted for a long time, filling the evening with warmth, trust, and love. The coffee had the perfect amount of cream. Annie curled up on the sofa with a blanket and a book, enjoying the peace and quiet before heading to her in-law's house for Christmas Eve later that evening. It was always the most chaotic family gathering since Jeff's family was large and almost all of them had children. This was one of the most significant differences between her family and her husband's family. As an only child, Annie was used to small, quiet gatherings. When she started dating Jeff, she had to learn to appreciate a completely different rhythm. She read the same page for the third time, still not understanding what was written there. She felt radiant after last night, and she owed it to her new hobby. Navigating love affairs with Jeff was a completely surreal experience. Annie picked up her phone and opened her browser again to look at her OnlyFans page. She had already watched it countless times this morning. The brunette scrolled through her page, looking at the photos she had posted from the previous day. She already had a little over 20 subscribers, and they actively commented every time she posted something. She stopped at the photo she posted last night. Her face, as always, was cropped. She took a couple more photos that left little to the imagination and looked damn sexy. She returned to her place in the church immediately after taking this photo, so no one suspected anything. She found it hard to believe the things people were saying to her now that she had a real account they could follow. She set a minimum subscription price because she was not interested in money. All Annie wanted was attention. She placed the phone on the table and took a sip of coffee with a smile. Jeff's truck stopped. The driveway was already filled with familiar cars. Annie climbed out of the passenger seat and then helped the twins out. The weather wasn't that cold that evening, so Annie put on a light sweater and tall black jeans that she bought at the mall. The sweater was a taupe color with a row of large buttons down the front for style. The children ran forward and joined several of their cousins who were playing in the backyard with limited light. Jeff and Annie carried the dishes they had brought inside, and Jeff's mother, Nancy, directed them where to put them. "Merry Christmas," Jeff said, hugging both of his parents. His father, Mike, was a big man, as was Jeff. His mother had a loud, cheerful personality, which Jeff also inherited. All the qualities she loved about Jeff seemed to come from his parents. Annie couldn't have asked for better relatives. The chaos was in full swing as they walked around greeting everyone. Children chatted loudly as they played games and ran out of the house. There were so many brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles that by the time Annie and Jeff had talked to almost everyone, it was dinner time. They sat near the head of the table with Mike, Nancy, and Jeff's little brother. The sound of metal on glass attracted the attention of everyone present. Mike stood at the head of the adult table to make the traditional toast he made every year. "It's always a special pleasure for us to see all our children and their families here on Christmas Eve. There is no greater gift for me than to be surrounded by those I love most. So I'll keep it short, because everyone is probably waiting to try this delicious food." Laughter rang out throughout the room. "For family, the basis of our life and the cornerstone of our community. May this Christmas be filled with joy, love, and the simple pleasures that make life truly meaningful." For the family, the toast was supported by a joyful exclamation. The sound of cutlery scraping plates and animated conversations filled the room. Jeff and his father mostly talked about the hardware store and holiday sales, while Annie turned her attention to Nancy and Jeff's little brother. They were easy to listen to, and the time passed quickly. Why, Annie felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, but she ignored it, choosing to focus on the moment. Nancy was telling a story about Jeff's grandparents, whom Annie never got to meet. She had heard this story 1,000 times, but she still laughed every time. Nancy could make any story exciting. Why, the phone vibrated again. Excuse me, I need to go to the bathroom, Annie said, moving away from the table. The voices died down as she headed to the bathroom in the living room. Once she was alone, she took out her phone and looked at her notifications. 2 personal messages in a row from one subscriber. She quickly moved to them to read. This lonely old man was hoping there would be another update today. Christmas Eve. The next message turned out to be a close-up photograph. Annie was startled, but didn't look away. This in itself did not affect her in any way, but the fact that the man was thinking about her and wanted to release himself by fantasizing about her turned her on. She didn't plan to post anything today, but the desire definitely appeared. She took several photos from different angles and decided to show a little more. By the time her impromptu photo shoot was over, her sweater and bra were completely off, her hair was disheveled, and she had more photos than she could possibly post. She looked at the time, realizing that she had been gone too long. We had to hurry to get back to the table. I hope you enjoy this Christmas gift, Annie wrote, choosing some of the most provocative photos and posting the album for all her followers. She saw no point in depriving them of this pleasure. Putting on her bralette and quickly buttoning up her sweater, she hurried back to the table. Desserts have already been served there. Annie tried to quietly return to her seat, but Jeff immediately noticed her absence. "Everything is fine?" he asked with a hint of concern in his voice. "Yes, everything is fine. My stomach was a little upset," she lied. She felt bad about it, but it was the easiest way to avoid questions. Annie placed the phone on the chair between her legs for safety. Jeff nodded in understanding. "Annie," Nancy caught her attention as she approached the table. "Would you like dessert while I'm up?" she asked. "Oh, no, thanks. Maybe a little later," Annie replied, maintaining her lie about her upset stomach. She joined Jeff and Mike's conversation about upcoming sporting events at school as a distraction. Why, the vibration of her phone reminded her of a recent post, and Annie involuntarily bit her lip, as she often did. "Well, Johnson's son, he'll be in 2nd grade next year, and they say he's the best athlete in the last 20 years, Mike remarked. "Perhaps," Jeff agreed, "but until we change the football coach, we won't see the playoffs. He hasn't changed his strategy for decades. Good luck convincing him to retire." "He already said that he wants to coach until he dies," Mike shook his head. Why, the phone vibrated between her legs again, and Annie involuntarily shuddered. "Is everything okay, Annie?" Mike asked her, looking intently. She didn't want to attract so much attention to herself. Yes, everything is fine," she smiled at him. Why? The phone vibrated again. "You know, I think I'll still try some dessert," she said to distract herself. By the time they returned home with the children, it was already late. After dinner, they had a long talk with Jeff's parents and brothers until it was past 10 o'clock. When they finally headed home, the night air had become significantly colder. Annie shivered as she stepped outside. The wind blew right through her light sweater. Jeff took off his jacket and carefully draped it over her shoulders, without even waiting for a request. "Thank you," Annie said, standing up on her tiptoes to kiss him. "Fuck," George shouted. "Go to the room," he added. Annie laughed. She had no idea where he could have heard such a phrase. A few minutes later, they entered the house. Jeff sent the twins to put on matching pajamas while Annie preheated the oven. The twins baked their own cookies for Santa, but Annie kept a close eye on them. They chose chocolate chip cookies because Jeff said Santa's favorite was the same as his. Annie will miss the times when children were so naive and believed in such things. The boys discussed what gifts they hoped to receive in the morning and argued about where Santa was currently on his path. "I'll put the coffee on," Jeff whispered. "We have a long night ahead of us." He started making coffee. When the cookies were ready, the boys placed them on a plate and placed them on the mantelpiece for Santa. They were absolutely delighted until Annie took them to bed. "Remember, if you leave your room tonight, Santa won't be able to come," Annie reminded them as she tucked them into bed. She kissed them both on the head and turned off the light. "Good night, see you in the morning," Annie said. She returned to the kitchen and took the mug of coffee Jeff offered her. "It's already late. Let's get started," Jeff winked at her. Annie took the gifts out of the closets where she had hidden them. They were all already packaged and signed as if they were from Santa. She carefully laid them out under the tree, taking a step back to evaluate the results. Perfect, she thought. The room looked packed to the brim. Annie put on her slippers and coat to quietly go outside and check on Jeff's work. He had already partially assembled the swing in the backyard earlier in the week and kept the parts in the workshop. Annie sipped her coffee as she watched him. Sometimes she would help him hold something in place while he secured the pieces. When he finished, they stood together in the yard, looking at the swing. "They'll definitely like this," Annie whispered to her husband. Jeff looked at his watch. "It's already past midnight," he said, hugging her. "Merry Christmas, Annie." "Merry Christmas," Annie replied, enjoying his hug. The morning air was cold when Annie woke up. She looked at her watch and saw that it was still very early. The house was quiet. There was nothing to indicate that the boys had already woken up. She felt warmth coming from Jeff behind her. She pressed herself even closer to him, but he seemed to still be sleeping. A couple of weeks ago, she would have let something like that stop her from getting what she wanted. But now everything has changed. "Annie, what's gotten into you?" He groaned. It looked like her husband was no longer asleep. "Make love to me." She knew he heard her by the look of shock on his face. He didn't answer, but obeyed. "It was incredible," Annie said. "Even more than incredible," he laughed, trying to catch his breath. "I hope we didn't wake the children. I'll get you a towel now." He went into the bathroom and soon returned with a towel so she could dry herself off. "Coffee?" Annie asked. She felt cheerful, but she always preferred it when he made the coffee. After that, he winked, hinting at their morning pleasures. "I can even cook you a 5-course breakfast if you want." "Coffee will be enough," she laughed, watching Jeff pull on his boxers and quietly leave the room to make coffee. Annie looked at herself again. She knew what she wanted to do. She took her phone and opened the camera to take some pictures from above. She looked through the photos carefully until she chose one. She cropped the image again to hide her face, maintaining anonymity. Annie put on her Christmas flannel pajamas, getting ready for the morning. But she couldn't wait any longer. She picked up her phone, opened OnlyFans, and selected a photo she wanted to post. With one click of the publish button, she added the post to her page. Jeff returned to the room with a mug of coffee, and Annie hurriedly placed the phone face down on the bed. She took the mug and took a sip. The coffee was hot and just the way she liked it. He sat down on the bed next to her. "Thank you," she said as he gently stroked her hair. "The morning was perfect. I'll go get ready. It seems the children have already started moving in their room," he said. Jeff got out of bed and headed to the bathroom. Annie picked up her phone and saw that the comments had already started pouring in. She couldn't help but smile as she sipped the coffee her husband had just brought. Jeff started talking from the bathroom. "I think we could start by having them open the radio-controlled car, since it's a shared gift," he said from the next room. Another comment popped up on the screen. "Yeah, sounds like a good idea," she responded, partially distracted by a new notification that popped up. Annie realized that she would do anything to feel this feeling again. Jeff came out of the bathroom, and she pretended to adjust her flannel pajamas. "I'll put the cinnamon rolls in the oven, and then we can open the presents," he said. He was now wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. She barely caught his words as her attention was focused on the new comment. Annie looked away from the phone and smiled at her husband, who was waiting for an answer. "Yes, I'll be out soon," she said with a smile. Annie got out of bed, put on her slippers, and grabbed a mug of coffee, heading into the living room to open presents with her family. She bit her lip and smiled. It was a pleasure to be on the bad girls list this year. Annie followed Jeff into the living room, trying to remain casual. Outside the window, the winter dawn was slowly brightening, the snow sparkled in the reflections of the street lamps, and in the house there was a sense of anticipation of a real Christmas miracle. The boys were already running out of their rooms, grabbing their prepared Christmas stockings and excitedly showing each other the treats that Santa had left for them. She saw Jeff smiling cheerfully at their wild reactions. His eyes shone with kindness and love, just like in those first days when they started dating. Annie suddenly felt a pang of conscience, remembering her hidden actions. But at the same time, a feeling of freedom filled her chest that she had never experienced before. The feeling that she is not only a mother and wife, but also a woman with her own desires and secrets. While the children were vying with each other to show off their toys, she knelt down by the tree and helped them open a box containing a radio-controlled car that they were about to launch in the garden. The twins gasped excitedly when they saw the large, bright red car and immediately began to study it. Jeff laughed and helped connect the batteries. For a moment, Annie's heart sank at how much she loved this man and her sons. An hour later, the house was filled with the smell of cinnamon buns and spruce resin, which was brought in from the cold with wood for the fireplace. The twins raced around with the car in the backyard, periodically peeking through the glass door to show their parents another trick and get an approving nod. Annie stood at the kitchen sink, looking at the sparkling snow. At that moment, the phone vibrated. "Merry Christmas, friend." Beth's cheerful voice came through the speaker. "Sorry to interrupt you, but I couldn't resist. Tell me, how is your morning there?" "Hello, Beth. Everything is fine. The boys are delighted with the gifts, and Jeff and I enjoy the silence." "When we get it," Annie laughed, glancing at the twins bustling around in the yard. Beth paused a little, as if hesitating whether to say something. "Annie, have you noticed that lately you, well, seem to be glowing? I looked at you in church today and thought, wow, our modest Annie looks very confident." Annie tensed slightly, but tried to remain calm. "Yes, maybe it's just a festive mood," she said, trying not to show her excitement. "If that's the case, that's wonderful," Beth replied warmly. "When a woman is happy, everything in her life gets better. I wish you not to lose this feeling. Okay, I'll run to my parents. Merry Christmas. Hugs to you." Annie hung up, realizing that perhaps she was not the only one who had noticed the change in her behavior. The day went on as usual. In the late afternoon, the whole family went to Annie's parents' and returned home late at night, tired and happy. The twins fell asleep in the car, and Jeff again carried them in his arms straight to the nursery. As Annie changed into her favorite loungewear, she found herself wanting to check her OnlyFans notifications. But at that moment, Jeff entered the bedroom. "Let's sit down for a minute," he said, suddenly turning off the lamp on the bedside table. "It seems like we haven't really talked to each other at all during all these holidays." She silently sat down next to him on the bed, sensing that the conversation might get tense. "I noticed that you have changed in recent months. You have become more beautiful, more confident. And, I really like this new thing about you. But I see that you also have some secret that you don't talk about. It seems to me that you have become happier, although sometimes more distant. I'm afraid I'm missing something important." Annie's heart pounded. She understood that he was very close to the truth. However, she didn't want to ruin it all. She took his hand. "Jeff, you're right. I actually have some hobbies. I wasn't sure how you would feel about them, so I kept them to myself for now. I just wanted to feel special, to be more than just a wife and mother." She felt his hand tense, but he didn't move away. "Isn't this something dangerous?" he asked carefully. Annie hesitated for only a few seconds, but understood that she could no longer hide fully, come what may. "I created an anonymous account on the internet. I publish photos there in which I hide my face, in a rather revealing way, and a lot of people like it. It gives me confidence. Maybe it's stupid or immoral, but I'm not doing anything illegal. I'm not cheating on you. I just love that someone sees me as more than just a humble teacher and mom of twins." She held her breath, waiting for an explosion or aggression, because Jeff had always been traditional in his views. He was silent for quite a long time. When he finally spoke, there was open shock in his voice. "I don't know what to say," he said quietly. "I admire you as a wife, as a mother, and it's hard for me to understand why you need the attention of some strangers. But I can see that it has made you more confident and brought back the spark to our relationship. In recent weeks, you seem to have come to life. I won't lie, I'm jealous, but I love you." Annie felt tears sting in her eyes. She leaned forward and hugged him. "I'm sorry if I hurt you. I was overwhelmed with boredom, and I began to doubt whether I was still desirable to you. I found this strange solution, and it captivated me, but I don't want it to come between us." Jeff sighed and ran his hand through her hair. "God, Annie, I'm sorry if I gave you a reason to think that I don't need you. I'm stuck in a routine, in worries, the store, the children, but that doesn't mean that I stopped loving you, or that you have ceased to be the most desirable woman in the world for me. It's just that sometimes I get tired and forget to show it." They sat for a long time, hugging each other in the semi-darkness of the bedroom. Annie felt the weight of guilt being lifted from her chest. Inside herself, she understood that a happy future was only possible through an honest conversation. Finally, she decided to say what was in her head. "Jeff, I can delete your account if it hurts you too much. Or we can somehow, I don't know, try something new together if you don't mind experimenting. But I don't want to keep it a secret, although I'm afraid that you might judge me." He was silent for a moment, thinking. He still looked confused, but was determined not to push his wife away. "I can't say that I completely approve of your decision. I'm not ready to see these photos and read the comments yet, but I want to understand why this inspires you so much. Maybe we need to bring passion back into our lives so that you don't look elsewhere for validation. But if it helped you realize yourself as a woman, I don't want you to give it up just for me. We'll probably find a compromise." Annie pressed herself closer to him, feeling a surge of gratitude. He could have delivered an ultimatum, demanded that everything stop immediately. But he didn't. From that moment on, everything went differently. Annie no longer hid her phone or flinched when notifications arrived. But the interest in the account subsided on its own. Knowing that her secret was revealed, she gradually stopped experiencing the same adrenaline from it. In return, she felt a great desire to focus on her relationship with her husband, because now there was a rare frankness in them. They began to talk heart to heart with each other more often and devote time to intimacy. Jeff also made an effort. He began to invite her somewhere together more often, recalling the times when they were young lovers. For the New Year holidays, Annie's parents took the twins with them, and the couple had a whole week for just the two of them. During these days, they not only became close again, they remembered why they fell in love with each other in the first place. Annie sometimes posted one or two photos on the internet for old subscribers, but without the same tension. Yes, she knew that somewhere out there were strangers admiring her appearance, but now she felt much more desirable next to her husband. When they returned the children, the house was again filled with their ringing laughter and the noise of constant games. But even in this whirlpool of worries, Annie and Jeff learned to find time only for themselves. Now they were not afraid to talk to each other about their needs and desires, whether it was the desire to spend a hot evening in the bedroom or ask for help with preparing dinner after a hard day. There were still many holidays and everyday life, joys and stresses, ups and downs ahead. This is what real family life looks like. But Annie knew one thing. She was not just a good mother and a modest teacher. She was a whole woman with her own secret dreams and passions. And now this part of her personality was not trampled by a feeling of shame, but, on the contrary, became a source of strength. With that strength in her, she and Jeff entered the new year hand in hand. They did not always understand each other, but they tried to hear and support each other. Looking at her husband and sons, Annie smiled. Even taking into account all the craziness and mistakes that she managed to make, her life was surprisingly harmonious. And perhaps the most interesting thing in their history was just beginning. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.